Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
And we are so excited to get into this one today.
Oh, man, yeah. I mean, imagine for a second that you were reading this really tense, high-stakes political thriller.
Right.
It's a story about this massive empire, a terrifying genocide plot, a brilliant orphan who rises up to become queen, and this cunning court official who basically risks everything to save his people.
Yeah, it's like a 10-chapter epic of survival.
Exactly. But then, as you turn the final page, you suddenly realize something deeply strange.
The glaring omission.
Yes, in this entire religious text, right?
Yeah.
In this story about the salvation of a faith community, the main character's God is never mentioned. Not a single time.
It is honestly one of the most fascinating literary anomalies in all of ancient history.
Right. I mean, that is the canonical Book of Esther. If you just read it straight through in the standard Hebrew Bible, it reads almost exactly like a secular geopolitical drama.
Yeah, it's full of palace intrigue, late-night assassinations, drunken banquets.
High-stakes diplomacy. But today, we're doing a deep dive into what is essentially the ancient world's director's cut.
I love that framing.
Yeah, we are exploring an apocrypha text known simply as the Additions to Esther. It's a collection of 6 passages containing exactly 107 verses that were woven into the Greek translation of the story centuries later.
And this director's cut takes that slick, secular political narrative and just it completely upends it.
Totally upends it. It injects this intense emotion, a massive cosmic and theological framework, and these incredibly dramatic, agonizing inner monologues.
It really changes the entire texture of the story. And our mission in this deep dive is to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-life application hidden within these 107 verses.
Because, when you read the Additions, you're no longer just looking at a historical record of what happened in some ancient Persian court.
Right. You are looking at a psychological mirror. This text reflects how human beings actually process existential threats. It shows us how people navigate entirely corrupt, toxic systems of power.
Which we all deal with in some form.
Exactly. And crucially, it shows how they find the courage to face down seemingly impossible odds when their lives and the lives of everyone they love are on the line.
Okay, let's unpack this because you just threw out a couple of terms that we need to define before we get lost in the weeds.
Sure, yeah.
First, the Apocrypha. For anyone listening who isn't, a biblical scholar, what exactly are we talking about here? Give me the explain like I'm 5 version.
Absolutely. So the word apocryphal literally means hidden things.
Hidden things, okay.
Yeah, and in the context of biblical literature, it refers to a collection of ancient books that were written by Jewish authors, mostly between the Old and New Testaments.
So like what timeline are we talking?
Roughly the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. These books were included in the ancient Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, which is called the Septuagint. But later on, they were not included in the official Hebrew canon. So depending on your religious tradition today, you might have these books in your Bible or you might not.
Got it.
And the additions to Esther fall right into this category. They are extra chapters and verses that only exist in the Greek version of the story, not the original Hebrew text.
So we are looking at a text that was highly influential, widely read in the ancient world, but kind of exists in this liminal space outside the standard canon for a lot of people today.
Exactly.
Now, to really understand why this director's cut even exists, we have to look at the world it came from, right? Because the canonical Book of Esther was written earlier, likely in the Persian period or shortly after.
Yeah, but these editions have a totally different origin story. They weren't written in Persia.
Right. Our sources indicate they were written in Greek, and they were likely composed by Hellenistic Jews living in Egypt.
And understanding that historical context is absolutely vital if we want to grasp the underlying psychology of this text.
Okay, Hellenistic Jews in Egypt. Walk me through that. Because we usually think of the ancient Jewish people in Jerusalem or maybe exiled in Babylon or Persia, which is where the Esther story takes place.
Right, right.
How did we end up in Egypt speaking Greek?
It's a great question. So after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 300s BC, Greek culture, language, and administration basically spread across the entire Mediterranean and Middle East.
Ah, Hellenization.
Yes, Hellenization. When Alexander's empire broke up after his death, Egypt fell under the control of one of his generals, Ptolemy. And the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years.
Cleopatra being the last and most famous of that line.
Exactly. So during this period, there was a massive Jewish diaspora. Tens of thousands of Jewish people were living in Egypt, particularly in the great city of Alexandria.
Wow, okay.
And they were so integrated into this Greek-speaking world that many of them no longer read Hebrew. That is precisely why the Hebrew scriptures had to be translated into Greek, the Septuagint, so this community could actually read their own heritage.
That makes perfect sense. So we have this community of Hellenistic Jews. They're living in Egypt under a Greek Macedonian ruling class, surrounded by native Egyptians.
Yep, it's a very complex cultural melting pot.
And to give us a timeline, our sources note there is a postscript attached to the Greek translation of Esther that dates it to around 114 BC.
Right, during the reign of Ptolemy the 8th or 9th.
But the editions themselves were likely incorporated or finalized a bit later, maybe around 80 BC onwards.
Exactly. And we really have to ask, what was the human problem they were facing? Why did they feel the need to take the story of Esther and add all this extra material to it?
They were stressed out.
Oh, deeply. The Jewish diaspora in Egypt was living as a minority. And our sources indicate that they were facing two massive simultaneous pressures. First, there was an internal pressure.
Which was what?
There was a growing laxity in their own traditions. When you live in a highly cosmopolitan city like Alexandria, it is incredibly easy to assimilate.
Oh, sure.
You start adopting the dominant culture, you maybe get a little indifferent to your heritage, and your unique identity starts to erode.
So it's basically the ancient equivalent of moving to a big city, getting a corporate job, and completely forgetting where you came from.
Precisely. But then the second pressure was external. They were facing potential and sometimes very real hostility from the native population and the political elites.
That's a bad combination.
It is. The relations between the domiciled Jews of the diaspora and the native populations were at times far from cordial. The native Egyptians often resented the Greek rulers, and the Jews, who were sometimes aligned with the administration, were just caught in the crossfire.
So they're dealing with an identity crisis on the inside and political vulnerability on the outside. That is a recipe for immense cultural anxiety.
A huge anxiety.
And it makes perfect sense how they responded. When a community feels marginalized, when they feel threatened by the broader culture, or, when they are worried about losing their kids to assimilation, what do?
They look back.
Right. They naturally return to the stories of their ancestors. They look for narratives of their people triumphing over hostile, massive empires. The editions were composed to meet a very real historical and emotional need.
Yes, they took the canonical Book of Esther, which is already a great story of survival, and they essentially said, this isn't just a political thriller. This is a theological blueprint for how we survive right now.
They expanded it to make it explicitly relevant to their current fears. Okay, I love this analogy. If the canonical Book of Esther is the official, state-sponsored historical textbook, the one that lists the dates, the decrees, the political maneuvers, the editions are like the community's private psychological diary.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
It is the behind-the-scenes footage that explains how the characters survived it mentally and spiritually. But I want to push back on something.
Okay, go for it.
If the original Hebrew text was already a masterpiece, and it is brilliantly written, super subtle, does adding inner monologues and explicit mentions of God actually make it better? Or does it just make it, less subtle? How does injecting all this theology change the fundamental nature of the story for someone reading it today?
That is the crucial question, and scholars have debated this for centuries. Some argue the additions ruin the literary subtlety of the original. But if we look at it through the lens of wisdom and human psychology, the additions do something essential.
Which is?
They change a story of sheer luck into a story of profound purpose.
Wow. Luck into purpose.
Think about it. If you read only the secular events in the canonical book, Esther's rise to power and the survival of the Jewish people looks like a series of incredibly fortunate coincidences.
Like winning the lottery over and over.
Exactly. A lucky break here, a king having a sleepless night there, a beauty contest won at just the right time.
Right. It almost reads like a Persian fairy tale.
But a marginalized community facing real-world violence cannot rely on a fairy tale. They cannot bet their lives on a series of lucky coincidences.
Yeah, that's not going to comfort anyone whose life is actually on the line.
Exactly. The editions peel back the curtain. They insist that behind the grand, seemingly random political chess moves in the Persian court, there was desperate prayer.
Right.
There was terrifying vulnerability. There was an agonizing search for meaning. The editions argue that human history isn't just a series of random bureaucratic events. There is a spiritual and emotional undercurrent driving it all.
So the survival of the community wasn't an accident.
No, it was the result of agonizing human courage meeting divine grace.
I love that distinction.
No.
A marginalized community cannot rely on luck, and they need purpose.
Yeah.
And honestly, it makes you wonder about the narratives we construct for our own lives today, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We all have a canonical version of our lives, don't we? It is your resume. It is your polished LinkedIn profile.
Your highlight reel.
Yes. It is the version of your career progression you tell at a dinner party, where everything sounds completely logical, strategic, and perfectly planned. Oh, well, I took this job, which naturally led to this promotion, which allowed me to start this company. It is a clean, secular, historical record.
But the reality is almost never that clean.
Never. The reality is the additions. The additions represent our inner struggles.
The messy stuff.
The late-night anxieties, the crushing imposter syndrome, the desperate hopes, the failures we covered up, the unseen motivations behind our public actions. The canonical resume says, promoted in 2021. The additions say, in 2021, I cried in my car every morning before walking into the office because I was so terrified of failing.
Yeah, and this ancient text is essentially giving us permission to acknowledge that messy, emotional, agonizing reality behind the polished public narrative. We don't have to pretend it was all just smooth, calculated strategy.
And what's so wild is that the author of these editions doesn't just start by giving us a peek into the emotional reality. They start by completely reframing the entire scale of the conflict.
Right, from the very beginning.
Yes, the very first edition takes us from the historical reality of feeling small in a big empire to a massive, almost overwhelming cosmic vision.
Yeah, let's dive into that. The editions actually open the book. What we call Edition A is placed right at the beginning of the Greek text, before the canonical story even starts.
It's Mordecai's dream.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it is incredibly cinematic. It reads like the opening of a high fantasy movie.
It really does.
So Mordecai, who is a Jew of the captivity serving in the king's court in Susa, he falls asleep and has this wild apocalyptic vision. The text says he sees noise and tumult, thunderings and earthquake, confusion upon the earth.
Just total sensory overload.
Yes. And then out of this chaos, two great dragons come forth, ready to fight, and their cry is great.
It is a terrifying primal image.
It really is. The text says that at the cry of these two dragons, every nation makes itself ready for war against a righteous nation. It is described as a day of darkness, gloom, tribulation, and anguish.
A literal doomsday scenario.
Exactly. The righteous nation is terrified, they are ready to perish, and they cry out to God. This isn't just a political disagreement anymore. This is cosmic warfare.
And this kind of imagery is a hallmark of apocalyptic literature. And apocalypse in Greek doesn't just mean the end of the world.
Right. People always get that wrong.
Yeah, it actually means an unveiling or a revelation. The author is pulling back the veil of ordinary political life to show the spiritual reality underneath.
So what looks like a mundane political thing is actually huge.
Exactly. To the naked eye, it might just look like a Persian court official drafting a memo. But in the spiritual reality, it is two massive dragons warring over the fate of the world.
But then, right in the middle of this global dragon-fighting turmoil, something completely unexpected happens in the dream.
The twist.
The text says, from their cry, as it were, from a small spring, there came up a great river, even much water. A light and sun rose, and the humble were exalted and consumed the glorious. And then Mordecai wakes up, keeps this entirely baffling vision in his heart, and just tries to understand it.
And what's brilliant is that the book gives us the exact interpretation of this dream, but it holds it until the very end. The final edition, Edition F, acts as a bookend.
Oh, I love a good bookend.
Right. Mordecai looks back on everything that has happened, the threat, the decrees, Esther's bravery, their survival, and he suddenly understands the dream.
He realizes the dream was a prophecy of the historical events they just lived through.
Yes. The interpretation is very explicit. The two dragons, that is Mordecai himself and Haman, the villain of the story. The nations are the geopolitical forces gathered to destroy the Jews. The righteous nation is Israel.
Okay, but what about the spring? That's the most striking image to me.
It is. The most transformative image in this entire cosmic vision is that little spring that turns into a great river with light and much water. Mordecai says explicitly, the river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen.
The river is Esther. That is a beautiful image. But let's translate this into 21st century realities because, most of you listening are not walking around interpreting your stress dreams as literal dragons fighting in the sky.
No, probably not.
So what does this all mean? How does this ancient apocalyptic imagery actually help someone sitting in traffic on their way to work today?
If we strip away the ancient mythology, it becomes a powerful, incredibly relevant metaphor for how we view conflict and power. Think about how we often view our personal or societal conflicts today.
Oh.
We look at massive systemic issues, toxic workplace environments, deep political polarization, runaway inflation, massive global crises, or institutional corruption.
Basically everything on the news.
Right. And when we look at these things, they feel like massive, insurmountable dragons fighting overhead. They create noise, tumult, and confusion. And how do we feel?
Powerless.
We feel entirely powerless. We feel like we are just standing on the ground, watching the dragons roar, waiting to be destroyed by the fallout.
We feel tiny. And because we feel tiny, we assume we are useless. I see this all the time. People wait to be the dragon.
Oh, exactly.
We think, unless I have the power of a CEO, unless I have millions of dollars in funding, unless I am a political leader with massive influence, I can't do anything to change this broken system. We think we need massive roaring power to affect change. We think you have to fight a dragon by becoming a bigger dragon.
But the profound wisdom of the text is actively rejecting that idea. The solution to the warring dragons was not a third, bigger dragon. The solution was a little spring.
A little spring.
The text suggests that a single individual, taking a small, authentic, deeply grounded action, can swell into a massive river that completely changes the landscape.
Wow.
Esther wasn't a dragon. She didn't have geopolitical power, military might, or even freedom of movement. She was an orphan, an ethnic minority trapped in a foreign empire's harem.
She had virtually no conventional power.
None. But her small acts of courage, choosing to fast, choosing to speak up, choosing to risk her life, swelled into a river that washed away the corrupt system and saved an entire nation.
It completely shifts where we locate power. Power isn't just in the loud, chaotic clashing of the people at the top of the food chain. True, transformative power often starts as something easily overlooked. A little spring bubbling up from the ground.
It's very subversive.
It makes you wonder, we all have those two dragons battling over our own lives, right? Those massive systemic issues that make us feel tiny and insignificant. It's hard to remember that just being a little spring, just choosing integrity in one small conversation is actually how the landscape changes.
It requires a massive shift in perspective. Once you identify the dragons in your life, the corporate noise, the family drama, the societal anxiety, the practice is to intentionally look away from the sky and look at the ground.
Stop staring at the dragons.
Yes! You have to stop obsessing over the macro-level chaos that you cannot control and identify one small spring action you can take today.
So what does a small spring action look like in a modern context? What's an example?
Well, it might be an act of quiet integrity in a corrupt office, refusing to cut a corner even when everyone else is doing it.
Right.
It might be initiating a difficult, vulnerable conversation with a family member that breaks a cycle of generational silence. It could be a single moment of courage where you stand up for a colleague who is being marginalized in a meeting.
Things that seem too small to matter.
Exactly. It is an action that seems entirely disproportionate to the size of the dragons. It feels too small to matter. But the wisdom of the text promises that the spring has the latent potential to shift the tide of the larger conflict. You don't have to be a dragon, you just have to be the spring.
You just have to be the spring. That is such a grounding way to look at overwhelming situations. It gives agency back to the individual.
It really does.
But of course, the story doesn't just stay in the cosmic abstract realm of dreams and metaphors. The author knows that dragons in the real world take the form of paperwork, policies, and politicians.
Oh, yes. Bureaucracy of evil?
The narrative zooms right in on the very real, very dangerous bureaucratic weapons used in the Persian Empire. And this brings us to a really chilling part of the editions. We are looking at the two royal decrees, which are labeled editions B and E. These texts are fascinating because they show us exactly, step by step, how systemic evil operates.
They do. In the canonical book, we get a brief summary of Haman's plot. We are told he offered the king money to destroy the Jews. But edition B gives us the exact text of Haman's decree.
The actual letter.
It is the full, formal letter sent out to the provinces of the empire. And the rhetoric used in this letter is a masterclass in propaganda.
Well, let's break down this rhetoric because I was reading it and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up.
Very dark.
Haman writes this decree in the voice of King Artaxerxes. He starts by talking about how much he loves his subjects and how his only goal is to establish the kingdom in lasting tranquility and peace.
Always pitching peace.
Right. He paints a picture of a utopia. But then he says, unfortunately, he has discovered a threat. He says there is a certain evilly disposed people scattered among all the nations. He claims this specific group has laws contrary to all nations. They continuously neglect the king's ordinances, and they are the sole obstacle preventing the uniting of our kingdoms. He frames them not just as different, but as the single malignant roadblock to world peace.
What's fascinating here is how timeless this political rhetoric is. This is the absolute banality of evil. Notice what Haman does not do.
What's that?
He doesn't say, I have a personal vendetta against Mordecai because he wouldn't bow to me, so let's kill his people.
Right, because that sounds petty.
He knows that won't work on a systemic level. Instead, he weaponizes the concept of otherness. He dresses up his personal hatred in the respectable language of statecraft, moderation, and public safety.
He sounds like a concerned bureaucrat. I'm just worried about unity.
Exactly. He takes a minority group's unique lifestyle, their distinct laws, their religious customs, their dietary restrictions, and he frames it as an active, malicious threat to the stability of the entire empire.
Oh.
He claims they are ill-affected towards our government and working to ensure the kingdom cannot attain security. This is the exact playbook used by totalitarian regimes throughout history.
It's terrifying how familiar it sounds.
You isolate a group, you highlight their differences, you blame them for the nation's problems, and you convince the majority that true unity can only be achieved by eliminating this specific minority.
It is horrifying. He decrees that they should all be destroyed root and branch by the sword, without pity or mercy, on the 14th day of the 12th month.
Just cold, calculated genocide.
And he promises the king that once they are gone, the state will be completely secure and unthreatened forever. Just let me remove this one problem and everything will be perfect.
Grand illusion.
But then, the story gives us incredible whiplash. Because later, after Esther intervenes and risks her life, the political winds shift. King Artaxerxes issues a second decree, which is Edition E, and this decree entirely revokes the first one.
Yes, and the language in the second decree is just as fascinating and, frankly, just as problematic as the first.
It is wild. The king writes this new letter, and he basically throws Haman under the bus completely. He claims he was completely innocent and was deceived by the specious words of his friends.
Typical politician dodging blame.
He calls Haman a trebly dyed villain and a pestilent man. But here is where it gets really strange and where we need your historical expertise.
Okay.
Artaxerxes says Haman was actually a Macedonian alien. He claims Haman wasn't a real Persian, that he had no Persian blood, and that Haman's real secret plot was to isolate the king and transfer the Persian kingdom to the Macedonians. Why is he calling him a Macedonian?
This is a brilliant example of how the later authors of these editions injected their own contemporary politics into the ancient text.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Remember who is writing this director's cut? Hellenistic Jews living in Egypt around 100 BC. Who is ruling Egypt at that time?
The Ptolemaic dynasty.
Right, who are of Macedonian Greek descent. The native Egyptians and many of the marginalized groups deeply resented the Macedonian ruling class.
Ah, I see where this is going.
So by changing Haman from a Persian official into a Macedonian alien, the author is essentially making an inside joke, or rather an inside political attack for their local audience in Egypt. They were turning the ancient villain into the face of their current oppressors.
Okay, that makes sense historically, but I want to push back on the morality of this text. Because as a modern reader looking for wisdom, this section is highly uncomfortable.
It is.
Haman used xenophobia against the Jews. He called them a foreign, malignant threat to get them killed. Now, the king uses xenophobia against Haman, calling him a Macedonian alien with impure blood, to justify executing him and reversing the decree. It seems like the text is just replacing one prejudice with another. The king isn't saying xenophobia is wrong. He's just redirecting it at a different target.
It is a profound discomfort, and you are absolutely right to point it out. This raises a major obstacle to growth for modern readers engaging with ancient sacred texts. And the discomfort doesn't stop with the xenophobia.
No, it gets worse.
The second decree doesn't just save the Jews by canceling the execution order. It explicitly authorizes them to defend themselves and destroy their attackers.
Yes, the text says they can avenge themselves on those who set upon them, and the king decrees that any city or country that doesn't follow this new order will be destroyed without mercy with fire and sword. made impassable for men and hateful to wild beasts and birds. The author of these editions clearly relishes this complete, violent, scorched earth vengeance.
They absolutely do.
So how do we handle this? What do we do when a text we are mining for moral insight endorses violent tribal retaliation and uses xenophobic slurs to defeat a xenophobe? We can't just gloss over it and pretend it's a nice story about a queen.
No, we absolutely cannot gloss over it. This is where we must practice reading wisdom literature with deep discernment. We do not have to blindly endorse the ancient political world's thirst for blood or their zero-sum game of tribal survival.
Right.
What we're looking at in Edition E is not necessarily a divine mandate for how justice should operate today. Instead, we are looking at a reflection of a traumatized people's fantasy of absolute security.
A traumatized fantasy. Tell me more about that.
When a minority community lives under the constant, suffocating threat of total annihilation, their narratives of deliverance often swing the pendulum all the way to the other extreme.
That makes psychological sense.
If you are powerless and someone is trying to eradicate you, the psychological fantasy of justice often looks like the total destruction of your enemy. The limitation of the author's ancient setting is the belief that true justice equals the complete annihilation of the other side. They couldn't envision a world of restorative justice or peaceful coexistence.
They just wanted the threat gone forever. Yeah. We can understand the trauma without endorsing the violent fantasy as a modern moral imperative.
Exactly. The enduring wisdom here is not in the violence. The wisdom is recognizing how easily human systems of justice and government can be manipulated.
Oh, for sure.
The text specifically warns about rulers being moved by the specious words of those entrusted with administration who beguile the innocent goodwill of their lords. It is a massive, flashing warning light about the power of propaganda, the danger of bureaucracy, and how easily the law can be used to authorize atrocities.
It's a very modern warning.
We must learn to spot the Haman rhetoric in our own time. The voices that claim a specific group is the only thing standing in the way of national unity. We have to be deeply suspicious whenever a leader says, if we just remove this one group of people, all our problems will be solved.
That is incredibly poignant, and it's a warning we desperately need today. We've looked at the macro politics, the decrees, the propaganda, and the cosmic visions. But the narrative naturally pivots inward. Surviving this kind of political nightmare takes a profound psychological toll on the individuals at the center of the storm.
It breaks people.
And this brings us to one of the most powerful parts of the text, the prayers of Esther and Mordecai in Edition C. Because before you can face the empire, you have to face your own soul.
And this is where the editions truly shine. They give us the inner emotional life that is completely missing from the canonical book.
Because in the Hebrew text, they just do things.
Right. In the Hebrew text, the characters just act. In the Greek editions, we see the agonizing internal wrestling that precedes the action. Let's start with Mordecai's motivation.
Right. If you only read the canonical book, Mordecai's inciting action can actually look a bit reckless. He refuses to bow to Haman. The text just says he wouldn't do it, but it doesn't give a detailed theological reason. And honestly, it can look a bit like stubborn pride. Haman is the second most powerful man in the empire, and Mordecai's refusal to bow is what sets off the whole genocide plot. You read it and you kind of want to shout, "Mordecai, just bow. Is your personal pride worth the lives of thousands of people?"
It seems incredibly selfish on the surface.
But in his prayer in Edition C, Mordecai clarifies his heart, and it completely reframes his actions.
It does. He prays to God and says, "Thou knowest, Lord, that it was not in insolence or in pride or in vainglory that I did this, for I had been content to kiss the soles of his feet for the salvation of Israel."
That line changes everything. He explicitly says he would happily humiliate himself, he would kiss the bottom of Haman's feet if it would save his people. It wasn't ego, he wasn't trying to act tough.
Not at all.
So why didn't he bow? He continues the prayer and says, "I did this that I might not set the glory of a man above the glory of God. And I will bow before none save before thee."
It wasn't pride. It was a radical, non-negotiable commitment to a hierarchy of values.
A hierarchy of values. Explain that.
In the ancient Persian court, bowing to a high official often carried connotations of divine reverence or absolute, unquestioning submission. Mordecai realized that if he bowed, he was acknowledging that the corrupt human system possessed ultimate authority.
Which he couldn't do.
He refused to give a corrupt human system the ultimate reverence that belongs only to the divine. He drew a line in the sand regarding where true authority lies.
It's a powerful statement of integrity. But I find Esther's prayer even more compelling. It is the emotional climax of the editions. It is raw, it is visceral, and it's completely heartbreaking.
Esther's vulnerability here is astounding. Remember her context. She is the queen of Persia. She lives in the ultimate luxury of the ancient world.
She has everything.
She is surrounded by attendants, gold, and fine garments. But when she realizes her people are going to be slaughtered and she has to risk her life to stop it, she retreats to pray. And the text describes a profound, almost violent physical transformation.
Shocking to read.
It says she takes off her glorious raiment. She strips away all her royal apparel and puts on garments of anguish and mourning. Instead of choice ointments and perfumes, she covers her head with ashes and dung.
Done.
She humbles her body with fasting, and wherever she used to wear ornaments, she fills her tangled hair with ashes.
I just want us to sit with that image for a second. She covers herself in dung and ashes. This is the queen of the most powerful empire on earth. It is an extreme, shocking act of self-abasement.
Completely undoing her royal status.
And then she prays. She says, "My Lord, our King, thou art God alone. Help me who stand alone and have no helper save thee, for my danger is in my hand." She's surrounded by servants, yet she recognizes her absolute terrifying isolation.
She knows she is fundamentally alone in this.
But then she says something in the prayer that honestly took my breath away. She talks about the burden of the crown itself.
Yes, she speaks about the agonizing reality of her position of power. She says to God, "Thou knowest my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud estate, which is upon my head in the days when I show myself openly. I abhor it as a menstruous rag, and I wear it not in the days of my leisure."
She calls the royal crown a menstruous rag. She completely viscerally detests the superficial glory of the wicked court she is trapped in. She says she hates the glory of the wicked, she hates the bed of the uncircumcised, and she has known no joy since the day she was brought to the palace.
It's an intense, devastating confession.
Calling the crown of Persia a menstruous rag is such an intense, specific metaphor. Why use that language?
Because in ancient Jewish law, a menstruous rag was a symbol of ritual impurity. She's making a profound theological statement. The crown, the ultimate symbol of worldly power, wealth, and success, is to her the ultimate source of spiritual impurity.
So she sees the power as a contaminant.
She is saying, my proximity to this corrupt power is polluting my soul. I only wear it because I absolutely have to, but I hate it.
Let's translate this to today's realities of leadership and corporate culture, because this is the ultimate ancient description of imposter syndrome, but with the massive moral weight attached to it.
Oh, that's a great connection.
Many people listening right now have to wear a royal robe. It might be a senior job title, a specific uniform, a professional persona, or an authoritative tone of voice you have to adopt to navigate a flawed, maybe even toxic system.
No, you have to play the game.
You have to project success, alignment with the company culture, and unshakable confidence, even if you secretly disagree with the direction the organization is going.
Esther shows us the agonizing tension of holding worldly power while trying to maintain spiritual integrity. She has to wear the crown to survive. She needs the authority of the royal robes to have influence and ultimately save her people, but she refuses to let the crown become her identity.
That's the key.
She knows it is a prop. She knows the system is flawed.
I think about how easily we let our titles fuse with our actual identity. We start to believe we are the VP of marketing, or we are the CEO, or we are the esteemed academic. We let the glorious apparel dictate our worth.
And that is precisely what Esther is fighting against. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see this exact same practice in other major wisdom traditions.
So really? Like what?
You see echoes of this in Stoicism, where practitioners are taught to mentally strip away the prestige of wealth and power to see things for what they really are in their base nature.
Okay, give me an example.
Marcus Aurelius famously wrote in his Meditations about looking at an expensive vintage wine and realizing it is just fermented grape juice, or looking at a royal purple robe and reminding himself it is just sheep's wool dyed with the blood of shellfish.
Reconstructing the glamour.
Exactly. You also see it in the ascetic practices of early Buddhism, where stripping away the ego and the trappings of worldly success is an absolute prerequisite to touching ultimate reality.
So Esther is practicing a radical deconstruction of her ego. She is stripping away everything the Persian world values: beauty, status, wealth, comfort, so she can stand authentically and honestly before the divine, before she goes into battle. She has to remember who she really is beneath the robes.
Exactly. And this offers a deeply practical reflection for anyone listening. We all need to ask ourselves, What is the glorious apparel or the professional mask you are forced to wear? And more importantly, has it started to fuse with your actual identity?
Do you think you are the crown?
Because if you fall in love with the crown, you will never risk it to do what is right.
That is the danger. If you love the robes, you become Haman. To counter that, we need a daily practice of taking off the crown. You probably don't need to use literal ashes and dung in your living room.
Please don't.
But you need a moment at the end of the day where you intentionally shed your titles, your status, and your professional obligations. You need a space where you stand completely unadorned and authentically before your core values, your family, or your higher power. You have to remember who you are when the robes come off.
Because you can't fight the dragons if you've been seduced by the crown. You have to stay grounded in the reality of your own vulnerability.
And that leads us perfectly into the climax of the narrative. Because prayer and internal reflection are absolutely essential. Taking the crown off is necessary to ground yourself. But eventually the morning comes.
The time for action.
You have to wash the ashes off your face. You have to put the royal robes back on, walk down the hallway, open the massive doors, and walk into the throne room.
This is where internal preparation meets external action. This is edition D, and it is the masterclass on courage.
Walk us through it.
Esther has finished her agonizing prayer. She has fasted for 3 days. She has faced her utter terror in the presence of God. Now, the text says she puts off her garments of humiliation and she clothes herself in her glorious apparel.
She suits up.
She uses the system's rules to approach the system. She doesn't walk in looking like a beggar. She walks in looking like a queen. The text says she is majestically adorned, invoking the all-seeing God, radiant in the perfection of her beauty, her countenance happy and lovely.
She puts the mask back on perfectly. But the text adds one detail that absolutely breaks your heart. But her heart was stricken with fear. She looks absolutely perfect, in control, and radiant on the outside. But inside, her nervous system is in complete overdrive. She is terrified.
Completely terrified.
She takes 2 maids with her, leaning delicately on one for support while the other follows holding her train. She walks a massive gauntlet. She passes through door after door until she takes her stand before the king.
And the description of the king in this moment is intentionally overwhelming. The author wants us to feel the sheer oppressive weight of his authority.
The ultimate dread.
Yes. He is sitting on his royal throne, clad in all his array of majesty, glittering with gold and precious stones. The text says he was very terrible. As she enters unsummoned, which is a capital offense, he lifts up his face that flamed with glory, and he looks upon her in fierce wrath.
She is facing the fierce wrath. And when she sees it, what happens? She doesn't deliver a brave speech. Her body completely betrays her. The queen falls down, changes color, and swoons. She faints right onto the head of the maid standing in front of her. She literally passes out from fear.
Her body just shuts down.
Now, I have to challenge this because from a strategic standpoint, fainting in front of a volatile ancient king seems like a terrible move. It makes her look incredibly weak, vulnerable, and out of control right when she needs to project power to save her people. Does the text view her fainting as a failure of faith?
It is a brilliant question. No, the text does not view it as a failure. It views it as the absolute limit of human capacity.
So it's not a moral failing?
Not at all. Her courage got her into the room. Her integrity forced her to walk through the doors. But her human strength reached its absolute limit in the face of unchecked, terrifying power. She physically shut down. And it is precisely in that moment of total weakness, when she has nothing left to offer, that the text introduces divine intervention.
What happens next?
The text says, "And God changed the spirit of the king into mildness." The terrifying, wrathful monarch is suddenly alarmed. He springs from his throne, raises her in his arms until she comes to herself, and comforts her with reassuring words.
It's a complete 180.
He says, "What is it, Esther? I am thy brother. Be of good cheer, thou shalt not die. For our commandment is only for our subjects. Draw near." He lays the golden scepter on her neck, embraces her, and says, "Speak to me." The fierce wrath is entirely transformed into grace.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to unpack this because while it is a beautiful ancient narrative, I see a huge potential trap for modern listeners trying to apply this to their lives.
Okay, let's hear it.
Does this text imply that if we just pray hard enough, put on our best suit, and walk into the room, God will magically change the personality of our aggressive boss? Or magically soften a hostile family member? Or instantly change the minds of our political enemies?
Right, the fairy tale ending.
Because in the real world, you can do all the right things, face your fear, act with perfect integrity, and the king still chops your head off. The boss still fires you. The system still crushes you.
It is a vital point. If we read this text as a guarantee of a magical fairy tale rescue, we are entirely misreading the wisdom. The text is not promising that the lion will always turn into a kitten just because you showed up.
So what is the wisdom?
The profound wisdom here is about the complex interplay between human courage and what we might call grace, or the unpredictable, unmanageable nature of reality. Look closely at what Esther actually did. She didn't stay in her room in her sackcloth, hoping the king's mind would change from afar.
She didn't just manifest it from bed.
No. She didn't wait for a sign that the coast was clear, that he was in a good mood. She did the terrifying, agonizing work of walking through the doors, despite being so afraid that her body literally collapsed.
She acted without any guarantee of success. Courage here is clearly not the absence of fear. She wasn't feeling brave. She was feeling actively, paralyzingly terrified.
Exactly. Courage is moving forward while actively terrified. It is trusting that once you step into the unknown, once you commit to the necessary action, a path might open up that you simply couldn't see from outside the room. She was only responsible for walking through the doors. She could not control the outcome.
But the grace met her there.
But the wisdom of the text suggests that grace, or the sudden shift in the situation, the unexpected opportunity, the softening of a hard heart, often meets us in the room. You have to show up to receive it. You cannot experience the mildness of the king if you are hiding in your chambers.
That is a phenomenal distinction. Grace meets you in the room. You have to take the step. So the crucial question for anyone listening is this: what is the lion's den or the throne room you are currently avoiding because of the fierce wrath you anticipate?
We all have one.
What difficult conversation, what career move, what necessary confrontation are you putting off because you are sitting in your room imagining the absolute worst-case scenario?
And the practice is to follow Esther's model. First, acknowledge the physical reality of your fear. It is okay if your heart is stricken. It is okay if you feel sick to your stomach. Fear is not a lack of faith. It is a biological reality.
Step one. What's step two?
Second, prepare as best you can. Adorn yourself, gather your facts, practice what you want to say, and bring your support system just like Esther brought her maids to lean on.
Love that.
But finally, take the step, walk through the doors, relinquish your desperate need to control the outcome, knowing that your responsibility ends with your courage, and let grace do the rest.
It is incredibly empowering. The additions give us such a rich psychological and theological depth to this story. But what is fascinating is that the human desire to embellish stories of survival didn't just stop with these Greek additions in Egypt. The tradition of expanding the Esther narrative continued for centuries.
Yes, it did. We've seen how the author of the Greek editions expanded the original Hebrew story to find theological meaning, but the Jewish tradition of engaging with this narrative continued to evolve.
It kept growing.
Our sources mention an exuberant midrashic tradition, later medieval legends and expansions found in texts like the Targums and other rabbinic writings.
Right.
Midrash is essentially a method of interpreting biblical texts by filling in the gaps, often using imaginative storytelling to draw out moral or theological points.
And some of these later legends are playfully absurd. They're massive exaggerations.
Yeah.
For instance, the sources tell us that in these later traditions, they claimed Esther was one of the 4 most beautiful women ever created in human history, alongside Sarah, Rahab, and Abigail.
Top 4 of all time.
They claimed her beauty was so supernatural that she never grew old. In fact, based on some intricate numerical calculations of her Hebrew name, Hadassah, some traditions deduced she was exactly 74 years old when she married the king, yet she looked radiant.
A 74-year-old beauty queen. And the embellishments weren't just about Esther, they expanded everyone's capabilities.
Oh, absolutely. Mordecai wasn't just a smart court official. He supposedly knew 70 languages, representing all the languages of the world.
A literal linguistic genius.
And when it came time for Haman's demise, he wasn't just hanged on a normal gallows. They claimed he was hanged on a tree 50 cubits high. That is roughly 75 feet tall.
Just towering over the city.
And not just any tree. They claimed the wood was taken directly from the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. It's just so wild.
When we read these medieval legends, it is easy to dismiss them as silly or unhistorical. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, we have to ask why these absurdities, these massive exaggerations, were added to the story.
It wasn't because they were ignorant.
It wasn't because people were stupid and didn't know history or biology. As the scholar W.O.E. Oesterle noted in our sources, People in dire distress are heartened by having their thoughts directed away from a cruel present.
Right, context is everything.
Exactly. These Midrashic legends were often codified during periods of intense, repeated persecution for the Jewish people in the Middle Ages. They were living in a reality where they were constantly overpowered, ghettoized, and threatened with violence by massive empires and kingdoms.
So when marginalized people are repeatedly traumatized, their stories of past triumph naturally become larger than life. The exaggerations aren't historical lies. They are emotional truths.
Emotional truths, yes.
They are truths about the sheer scale of the relief they felt at surviving.
Yeah.
If your current oppressor feels 50 cubits tall, if your current trauma feels insurmountable, you need a story where the ancient villain was hung on a 50-cubit tree. It's a way of saying the bigger they are, the harder they fall. The impossible can be overcome.
Precisely. It is a psychological coping mechanism. It is how the human brain processes both severe trauma and the ecstasy of victory when the reality is almost too intense to bear. They were writing their emotional reality into the text. They needed a Mordecai who was infinitely smart and an Esther who was impossibly beautiful because they needed a hope that was larger than their current despair.
And we do this today. We think we are so modern and rational, but we do the exact same thing. Think about how we tell the story of a difficult startup phase in a company, or a harrowing medical illness, or a massive family drama.
We definitely embellish.
The way we recount those events years later often takes on mythical proportions in our own minds. The bad boss from 10 years ago doesn't just remain a bad manager. In our stories, he becomes a literal demon of incompetence.
Right, the absolute worst boss in human history.
Exactly. The late nights at the office become epic, Herculean battles of endurance. The doctor who gave the right diagnosis becomes an omniscient savior. We exaggerate the details because the literal dry facts don't do justice to how it felt to survive the ordeal.
It is a profound reminder that humans do not just need data. We need myth. We need narratives that are big enough to hold our deepest fears, our deepest grief, and our greatest reliefs.
Yes.
The additions to Esther and the beautiful, extravagant legends that followed centuries later show a people absolutely refusing to let their story of survival be reduced to dry, secular facts. They insisted on finding the hand of the divine, the depth of human emotion, and the massive cosmic significance in their survival. They refused to believe it was just luck.
They insisted on purpose. Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We have spent this time looking at how ancient people added layers of meaning, prayer, theology, and emotion to a historical text to make sense of their lives. So the question is, if the Book of Esther required additions for ancient people to fully process its meaning, what additions are you currently writing into the story of your own life?
It is a crucial question. Are you interpreting your current struggles strictly through the cold secular facts? The budget cuts, the sterile medical reports, the logistical failures, the unreturned emails? Or are you allowing yourself to step back and see the deeper spiritual, emotional, and perhaps even cosmic dimensions of what you are living through? Because the bare facts, the canonical resume, rarely tell the whole truth about who you are becoming in the fire.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.